Hi everyone, this is Devon from Monistic, and today we're going to take a journey through understanding Scope 3 emissions. If you've started looking at your carbon footprint, you've likely started at direct emissions, fuel, and purchased electricity. That's a great start, but Scope 3 is where some of the trickiest but most important parts of carbon reporting lie. So let's get into it. What are Scope 3 emissions? Think of them as the indirect emissions in your value chain. They don't come from your own buildings or vehicles, which is Scope 1. They're not from the electricity you buy, which is Scope 2. Scope 3 is everything else in the wider world that happens as a result of your company's activities. It's your suppliers making raw materials. It's your customers using your products. It's even the business trips your employees take. Basically, if it's not under your roof, but it's connected to your business, it's probably Scope 3. Scope 3 emissions are important because they usually make up around 70 to 90% of a company's total carbon footprint. Yep, the vast majority, which means if you're only reporting Scope 1 and 2, you're missing out on the elephant in the room. And companies can't really dodge this anymore. Standards like SBTi, IFRS, and TCFD all require a good handle on Scope 3. Plus, if you're serious about hitting net zero, you need to start measuring it. What are Scope 3 emissions used for? Why go through all this effort? Because Scope 3 data is actually super useful. It helps you build stronger sustainability strategies, it helps you spot the areas with the biggest climate impact, and even get your suppliers on board with carbon reduction. It makes your ESG disclosures way more credible. Investors and customers really care about this stuff. So here's where it gets a little bit intense. Scope 3 is split into 15 categories. It might sound overwhelming, but the good news is that not all categories will apply to every business. Broadly speaking, we're looking at things like purchased goods, business travel, waste, use of products, and even investments. So yeah, Scope 3 really does cover everything from cradle to grave. Let's look at each of these categories in detail to see what it means, how it's measured, and how to collect the data. Purchased goods and services. These are emissions from the production of goods and services purchased by the company. It includes raw materials, components, and outsourced items. Think of all the stuff your companies buy, from the raw materials to software, even catering. All of that has an emissions impact. So it measures your supplier Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for your purchased products and services, and it applies to physical goods as well as intangible goods like consulting. You can collect the data in two ways. Initially, a spend-based approach is what you usually use, where you use your financial data based on the industry that you've spent the money and apply a relevant emissions factor. That is an estimate that uses some assumptions. When you want to get a bit more granular, you can use activity-based approach, where you gather supplier-specific or lifecycle assessment data for the specific product or supplier that you're purchasing from. Capital goods. These are emissions from the production of capital goods purchased by the company. It includes things like buildings, machinery, equipment, and IT infrastructure. So it measures all the upstream emissions from producing these long-lived goods, because your long-lived items like your machines and your servers and your buildings, they come with embedded carbon from day one. You collect this information in a very similar way to purchase goods. You can use a spend-based approach by certain emissions factors on how much money you spend, or you can talk to your suppliers and request embodied carbon reports from manufacturers. Fuel and energy-related activities. These are emissions from producing and delivering fuel purchased by the company. It covers upstream emissions of fuels before they reach your site, because even before the lights turn on in your office, there are emissions from extracting, refining, and transporting that energy, as well as transmission and distribution losses from the grid. You can collect this data using a standard factors approach, where you use government-published factors relative to the energy that you've consumed. Alternatively, you can use a supplier approach, where you use utility company provided data for the amount of energy you've purchased from that supplier. Next, we have upstream transportation and distribution. These are emissions from transportation and distribution of products purchased by the company. It includes emissions from third-party logistics like freight and shipping. These, importantly, are goods that are transported from the supplier to your company. Planes, trucks, and ships moving your product around. If a lorry delivers goods to you, those emissions are calculated in this category. You can calculate data using a distance-weighted approach. So you estimate emissions based on the distance traveled, the weight, volume of your delivery, and the transport mode, whether it's a van, a lorry, sea, or air. Alternatively, you can use carrier data approach, which is a bit more granular, where you request emissions reports directly from logistics providers or freight forwarders. Next, we have waste generated in operations. These are emissions from third-party disposal and treatment of operational waste, including landfill, recycling, composting, and incineration. So that bin in your office, once it leaves your site, the emissions from landfill, recycling, or incineration are in your Scope 3. It measures all greenhouse gases generated from waste after it leaves the company, namely methane from landfill. You can collect this data using a weight-based approach, using waste contractor data relative to the amount of waste that they've taken and the different types. You can use estimates based on a spend-based approach, so how much money you've spent on managing your waste by relevant emissions factors, but this requires a fair bit more assumptions and estimates. Next, we have business travel. These are emissions from transportation for work-related activities, including flights, trains, taxis, any hired vehicles. It measures the greenhouse gases generated by third-party vehicles transporting employees for business purposes. So things like flights to client meetings, trains to conferences. It's basically the cost of carbon of working on the go. You can collect this data using a travel management system, which logs your start and end point and the modes of travel, whether it's a plane or a train. Important to note here that the class that you travel in when you fly significantly alters the emissions factor. Alternatively, you can use expense reports where you can estimate distances and travel, although this uses a fair few assumptions and isn't always very accurate. Next, we have employee commuting. These are emissions from employees traveling between home and their usual place of work. This includes all transport modes as well as working from home. So it measures the the greenhouse gases of employee travel outside of the company, emissions from private cars and public transport mainly. The best way to collect this data is to use an employee survey. So this survey should include things like the mode of transport, the distance, and how often it's done. Normally, a 20 to 30% response rate is representative, and we can scale that to the whole workforce, provided they live in a similar sort of area. Next, we have upstream leased assets. These are emissions from assets leased by the company from another organization. It includes buildings, vehicles, or equipment not already included in Scope 1 and 2. It covers the operational emissions of leased assets where the lessor retains control, but it often overlaps with Scope 1 and 2 if it's not clearly defined. So the best way to collect this data is to look at the lease agreement and identify energy using leased assets. Second step is to ensure that you haven't already accounted for these in Scope 1 and 2 usage, and then put them into this category if they are using energy. You can use a spend-based approach to apply a relevant emissions factor to lease spend if you don't have the usage data of the particular product. Next, we have downstream transportation and distribution. And similar to section 4, upstream, these are emissions from transportation and distribution of sold products to your end customers, including third-party logistics and retail storage. It calculates the greenhouse gas emissions from outbound logistics under third-party control. You calculate this in a very similar way. You estimate the emissions by weight, distance, and transport type. And if you're using a freight provider or a logistic provider, you can use carrier-supplied data, especially if your goods are traveling in 3 or 4 main routes. Next, we have a processing of sold products. These are emissions from processing sold intermediate products by third parties before they reach end consumers. So these measure emissions that from additional manufacturing after you've sold something. So it applies to companies that sell semi-finished goods that are used in other manufacturing processes. The best way to collect data for this is to use industry averages. So use published emission factors for processing industries and multiply that by the volume that's been sold. Next, we have use of sold products. These are emissions from the use of goods and services sold by the company. It applies if the product requires energy or fuel during its use phase. So it measures the emissions generated while the customer is using a product. Importantly, it only focuses on energy-consuming goods like vehicles or electronics and doesn't apply to goods that don't produce emissions like clothes. You can collect this data using an average use approach, so estimate average energy or fuel consumption over the product's lifetime. Alternatively, you can conduct a customer survey where you can use actual usage patterns where customer data is available. Cars have started using the latter as data methodologies have gotten more sophisticated. Next, we have end-of-life treatment of sold products. These are emissions from waste treatment and disposal of sold products after customer use. It includes recycling, landfill, and incineration. It measures the greenhouse gases generated during end-of-life processing, and it focuses on downstream emissions post-consumption. The best way to collect data for this is to conduct a material flow analysis, which estimates the end-of-life treatment pathways for all the different components within the product. Alternatively, you can use a standard factors approach based on the materials that are within the product that has been sold. Next, we have downstream leased assets. These are emissions from assets owned by the company but leased to other people. It covers operational emissions under lessee control, applies to buildings, vehicles, or equipment leased out by you. You can collect this data using a usage data approach where you gather energy and fuel data from lessees, but where this information isn't available, you can estimate emissions if the usage data isn't available. So depending on how much they spend on a particular vehicle under the agreement, we can estimate the usage from there. Next, we have franchises. These are emissions from franchise operations not owned by the reporting company. It includes energy, fuel, and waste from franchisee-operated sites. So clearly the best way to collect data for this is to request energy and full carbon emissions from franchisees, but where this isn't available, we can estimate based on a typical franchise operations. Investments. These are emissions associated with investments and financial assets held by the company. It captures emissions from companies or projects funded through debt, equity, or loans. The PCAF has a methodology and standards that you can use that you can apply to your investments. Alternatively, you can engage with your portfolio and request emissions data from your investors. So there you are. there was a brief overview of the 15 Scope 3 emissions. Not all of them will be relevant to your business, but for the ones that are, they're a necessary marker to know your full carbon footprint and to get your sustainability journey started. I hope this has been useful. This is Devon from Monistic, and I'll see you next time.